Okay, so let's review for Unit 2. And so let me go back here to the first slide. And okay, let's go ahead and walk through what you need to know for Unit 2. Okay, so first of all, realize that you need to know the term biodiversity. It's also sometimes referred to as biological diversity. It's essentially a measure of both the richness and the evenness in a given area. And so richness is the number of different species versus evenness, which is the number of individuals of different species. Okay, so for instance, number of different species, I've got three different species. I've got hawks, I've got mice, and I've got grasshoppers. So those are my three different species. Versus evenness, where how many hawks do I have versus how many mice do I have versus how many grasshoppers do I have. So make sure that you understand the difference between those terms. Then understanding that there are three levels of biodiversity. So there's genetic biodiversity, variation of genes, either within a species or between different species. There's species biodiversity, which is the variation of a species within a population. So the variation of mice per se in the example I gave you previously, or the variation of species, the variation between those three different species. So the variation between hawks versus mice versus grasshoppers. Okay. And then there's also ecosystem biodiversity. So the variation of the species, communities, habitats, and the processes all within one ecosystem. So make sure that you understand those three levels and also the difference between evenness, richness, and then understanding what biodiversity is. Okay, you need to know what genetic drift is. Genetic drift is when there's gene flow either between or within populations of same species or different species. It often decreases genetic variation by bottlenecks and founder effects. Bottlenecks, something like a fire moving in and just kind of wiping out everything, and that really seriously drastically reduces the genetic diversity like instantly. Versus a founder effect, where where a small population of a small subset of a population. So a few of the species might move to a new area. Thus, now they've got a really tiny population, and that seriously reduces the genetic diversity. So those are the two differences there. Understand the difference between a generalist and a specialist species. I think we're probably pretty good with those terms. If you have questions, make sure you ask. Understanding those four words: invader or invasive species, keystone species, endemic species, and indicator species. If you aren't sure of one of those, go to the slide deck and then click on those terms. And then understanding the different types of ecosystem services. So we've got provisioning, regulating, cultural, and then knowing that supporting services are kind of the foundation for the other three. So we couldn't have those other three types of ecosystems. We wouldn't even have ecosystems if we didn't have these supporting services that ecosystems provide for us. Okay, so that's really important. Understanding the impact of humans on ecosystem services. You can click on this picture. It takes you to a really nice, this Khan Academy website that talks about the human impact on biodiversity. It gives us lots of different terms. That maybe wouldn't be a bad thing to go through and read on Khan Academy, just to get a little bit more information under your belt. Here's a really nice video on island biogeography if you're interested in watching that. But understanding, that the closer you are to the mainland, the more genetic diverse or the more biodiversity that you have, or the larger the island, the more biodiversity that you have. Understanding this range or zone of tolerance and knowing the zone of intolerance where nobody lives, the zone of physiological stress. Things are living, but not for long under these conditions. They need to be in their optimum range in order to survive. So understanding those different zones. Also understanding that it's a bell curve. Here we have most of our species surviving right here in the middle of this optimum range, and the numbers start to decline fairly drastically as we move closer to that zone of physiological stress. So understand that zone of tolerance. And then ecological resistance versus resilience. Resistance, we can maintain, the ecosystem maintains normal functions and processes when there's some sort of a disturbance, versus resilience, how quickly does an ecosystem recover after a disturbance. So resistance is kind of as the disturbance is happening, resilience is after. Understanding those benefits of fire. So I'm going to let you read that here. Leaf litter and things on the ground equals fuel for a fire. So the more leaf litter you have, the more fuel you have, the hotter the fire burns, which means we kill more trees. And so that's why we have these prescribed burns to keep the amount of leaf litter on the forest floor down. It also helps maintain native species because they're not non-native species are not adapted to fire. And then it also thins the forest canopy so that sunlight can actually reach the forest floor. All right, and then we have the two different types of succession. Basically, primary, there is no soil, we have rock. And so we have to create soil and nutrients within the soil, and that's what lichens do, these pioneer species of primary succession. Knowing that that's different than secondary succession, which the soil is still intact and can grow plants. So pretty much right away, this recovers. And the pioneer species here are a lot different than the lichens, the pioneer species back here. Okay, so I think that's it for review. If you have any questions, please let me know.